From News Center 30, this is Connecticut Newsmakers. Today's guest is John G. Devine, Special Agent in Charge, FBI, State of Connecticut. He'll be interviewed by Tom Monaham of News Center 30.
Very pleasant good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Sunday's edition of Connecticut Newsmakers. John Devine is our guest on the program. Mr. Devine is a native of Pennsylvania, was appointed to the FBI back in 1950. Served in major cities in the nation until 1974, at which time he was appointed Assistant Special Agent in Charge of the FBI office in Anchorage, Alaska. A short time later, he took a similar position in San Juan, Puerto Rico, a number of other offices along the way, and then just a short relative period of time, he became Special Agent in Charge of the FBI office here in the state of Connecticut. Mr. Devine, thank you so much for being with us on our program.
Tom, it's my pleasure.
I think a lot of people might have a misconception of what the FBI is. Perhaps we could start off by talking about what is the FBI, what is its major role?
Well, Tom, really, the FBI had its inception as what they called the old Bureau of Investigation in 1908. But the FBI, as we know it today, you might say, began with the advent of Mr. J. Edgar Hoover as director in 1924. Sometime after he took over as director, the name was changed to Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, as we know the title today. And primarily, the jurisdiction grew out of crises of the moment, you might say. The jurisdiction was rather limited at first, investigating thefts of government property. Interstate transportation didn't come along later, but the primary mission of the FBI was to address theft of something belonging to the government. Some of the scandals, the Teapot Dome scandal, I think, triggered the necessity for a federal investigative agency. Then in the early 30s, bank robberies, for example, were under local jurisdiction, and yet they had the problem of the Dillingers and the Babyface Nelson and Pretty Boy Floyd and those guys would hit a bank and then they'd go interstate, and it became rather difficult for state or local agencies to deal with the interstate nature of it, so bank robbery became a federal crime as long as the bank was insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And then you had kidnappings. Then in the late 30s, getting into internal security and domestic intelligence by presidential directive when Franklin Delano Roosevelt identified problems that had been synonymous with World War I. FBI got the jurisdiction, and it just grew. Legislation would come about and they'd say, well, who's going to have the primary jurisdiction, and say FBI. Today, we have about 200 classifications over which we have primary jurisdiction. Now, some of them are minimal, and yet some of them are major. You get into still bank robberies, but not to the extent, because there's a changing complexion on handling bank robberies today. I think we could say most of the priorities today are geared toward organized crime, public corruption, foreign counterintelligence, and white-collar crime.
Mm-hmm. Where do your responsibilities begin where perhaps state and local authorities' responsibility might leave off?
Well, really, some of them are clearly identified, but again, you get into bank robberies, for example. That could be a local crime, it could be a state crime, and it could be a federal crime, just because of the nature of the beast. It's an armed robbery. Right. So a local municipality investigating armed robberies, if such an incident happens in their town, they have jurisdiction. The state would have jurisdiction, and then the federal government would have jurisdiction. Fortunately, there is a great deal of cooperation. The response, to my knowledge, has always been excellent. And then there's been a clear understanding, I think, as to who is going to take jurisdiction in this day and age. If a local police department would more or less make an immediate apprehension, then obviously they should just pursue it. They have all the evidence, they've done all the work, and then take it through the court system. If it turns out to be a long-term investigation and the subject is identified as going interstate, then it would be better that the FBI would handle this type follow-up.
Why is the American public so skeptical, do you think, of organizations like the FBI?
Gosh, I don't know that I agree with that. The selection of words with the question. I don't think the American public is skeptical of the FBI. I think there is a certain segment who has raised a number of questions about, maybe some of the techniques that were used during the past, but some of the so-called public polls that they have had in the not-too-distant past have resulted in identification of most people in a positive way with the FBI, the manner in which they've conducted themselves, and the manner in which we're carrying out our responsibilities. But to get into specifics and try to answer your question, I guess you go back into the 60s when there was definitely a changing complexion, a more questioning approach to all law enforcement, and certainly the FBI, I guess, was at the forefront because some of the political type activity that was going on, dissidents, some of the activities on college campuses and so on. Then you had some of the dissident groups became involved in bombings of federal facilities, National Guard centers, ROTC centers, some campus facilities that were financed by the federal government. And then you had increasing jurisdiction. And I think it's all maybe taken into consideration. So much publicity, so much criticism, and it did create an aura of uncertainty. And again, getting into skepticism, you might, if you want to go along with that word, about the activities of the FBI or CIA or anyone involved with intelligence-type gathering. And I think this is where we got most of the criticism from any area that might have had connotations of intelligence operations.
Are your hands tied now in terms of trying to fight crime and the laws which might have come out of the 1960s?
No, I don't think anyone's hands are tied as far as fighting the actual violations that we identify as hard crime. Where we have most difficulties now would be in the area of domestic intelligence, internal security, because that's where most of the questions were raised. The use of some of the techniques, surreptitious entries, question about use of wiretaps to access and so on. And I think it's that area more than the old stereotype hard crime.
To what extent is are wiretaps used? I know that every agent is not allowed a wiretap.
If we would follow some of the hysteria of the 60s, you would swear, and you'd have numerous calls from people saying, my phones are tapped. Everyone felt that, they were liable to having their phones tapped. And it was rather interesting. I did a survey for one of the Connecticut newspapers, or an article, you might say, and part of that article I ran a survey and found out that, as I recall now, there were about 40-some wiretaps. And this is when you're considering there are 155 million phones in use in the United States. So you can see how infinitesimal this really was. And most of those were state wiretaps also. But it isn't a widely used technique. And really, to use it, you have to satisfy all the legal ramifications, and have had to do so. You'd have to, first of all, prepare a voluminous affidavit that spells it out without any question as to exactly who is the individual, where the facility is, and right down the line. And we'd have to submit that to our headquarters, and they in turn would submit it to the Department of Justice, and the Attorney General would have to authorize it as okay. So it's a tough process, especially when immediacy is in question.
Did you know Mr. Hoover personally?
Yes, maybe more so than a lot of people had the pleasure. When he was serving as director of the FBI, you met him when you finished training school. It was just a perfunctory type thing, casual. You'd get to say hello, shake his hand, and then you'd go to the field and go to work. But I served in and out of Washington on a number of occasions, so did have much more opportunity than the ordinary agent on the street would have had.
How about his tactics?
When you say his tactics, he was responsible certainly for the tactics that were used. He was what you might describe as a martinet. He was a strict disciplinarian, and people would say a hard man to work for, but you knew exactly where you stood, and you knew exactly what he expected. He took over the FBI when it was known as a rather corrupt political appointees handling the responsibilities, and basically not getting the job done. In fact, they were thinking of disbanding the Bureau of Investigation and just do away with Federal Investigative Agency. But he was given the job as director and given the dictate, and he brought it from that to what I would consider the best law enforcement agency in the world. In later years, there was considerable criticism, and again, most of that derived from the type crime that would say, or the type involvement that would say would have political connotations. But I had no quarrel with the tactics as they were used. We question them now, but we're operating under different perspective this day and age. I'm very comfortable with my recollections, with my associations of J. Edgar Hoover. I think he was a great American, dedicated certainly to doing everything he possibly could to preserve America as a democracy. Some of the criticism that came along later, they said he had too much authority. Well, he had as much authority as the Congress and the oversight committees would permit him. And when we're talking about there's a necessity for an oversight committee, these have been in existence all along. And if anything, if people want to point the finger at the FBI, they should point the finger at the Congress, the Senate, who have been in power all the time and could have questioned these things back when they were occurring. Some of the techniques or some of the tactics that were used under Mr. Hoover were used from the 1930s when President Roosevelt gave by presidential directive certain jurisdiction to the FBI. Now, back there is maybe when the error was initially made. They just said, get the job done in internal security. Initially, our responsibility was dealing with hostile governments. You're thinking of Germany during World War II, Italy, Japan, and some techniques were used there to try to resolve some problems regarding intelligence. And then, unfortunately, those same techniques were used through the years as the investigations got into investigation of the Communist Party in the United States, investigation of Soviet-type activities, and then in the 60s, investigation of dissident-type groups. And it turned out that these tactics, which were accepted on the highest levels of government, the Department of Justice right up to the presidency, they were found acceptable for many years, and then some certain individuals running for public office identified this as something horrible that's been happening, and yet these same personalities were very much aware of the techniques that were used and very much aware of the information that came as a result of the use of these techniques. But again, I'm not apologizing for the use of them. I'm just saying that through the years they were accepted and were used without thought being given to them.
As a man who is approaching 30 years with the FBI, how do you react to statements by some people, and admittedly so very, very few people, who seem to feel or suspect that the FBI might have played a role in some...
I think I would like to just dismiss it and say I don't even want to dignify something so idiotic by responding to it, but I call it most irresponsible. And in the recent past now, we've had a national figure appearing and saying he wasn't questioned about whether conspiracy, he wasn't questioned by the FBI, he wasn't questioned by the police, and yet it's a historical fact that this same individual was questioned.
We're talking about.
Correct. He was questioned by the Memphis Police Department at length. He was questioned by the FBI and never on those occasions indicated in direct response to whether there was a conspiracy. He said no idea that there was any such thing.
Why do you suppose he would deny something like that, like he did the other day before the committee?
Well, I don't know that he denied it. Unfortunately, I didn't see these hearings, but he certainly didn't come out and indicate that he had been questioned along these lines, or admit that he had been questioned along these lines. And I feel that that leaves an erroneous impression as far as the viewing public is concerned. To excite an awful lot of and our primary concern is the return safely of the hostage. The money, regardless of amounts, it's still one of those material things that I'm sure we can make an adjustment to without any problem. Basic is return of the hostage. If the family would come to us and say, we don't want you involved in any way, we would draw back and then take up when they have their relative back in their hands and have to try to play catch-up. It makes it more difficult, naturally. It's an area where law enforcement has the expertise. Every family isn't going to study up on kidnappings as to what they're going to do if they're confronted with this situation. We hope to get in as early as possible because it's going to give you that much more chance for success. But again, we're going to abide by the wishes of the family, get in when we can, as soon as we possibly can, and then go from there and try to make a successful apprehension of the perpetrators.
Political kidnappings appear to be on the increase, particularly in foreign countries. Do you see this trend increasing here in the United States? Do you see this problem coming to our nation?
No. You have different climates in different countries. Italy, for example, now you have a lot of kidnapping for ransom, of course, but the ransom is being demanded there sometimes to finance political adventures of one sort or another. When you're talking about the terrorist type group, you're thinking of the same type crime, possibly. But so far in the United States, we haven't identified that. Here we have the kidnapped victim being taken for ransom, no political connotations, and I can't see that happening to the extent that they've experienced overseas. One thing we do have to realize, though, that we do have, you get into terrorism and a political type kidnapping, we do have some potential because you have some of the old dissident type who have been in touch with some of the terrorist groups in different sections of the world. And they do identify with each other. Their cooperation with each other is widespread. An interesting sidelight, if you remember back, of course it wasn't a kidnapping, but when you think back to the Lode International Airport incident where they had that massacre, to show how these people contact each other, assist each other, that particular incident was planned by Palestinians in West Germany. Then it was carried out in Israel by 3 Japanese revolutionaries using weapons manufactured in the Soviet Union, purchased in Italy by an Algerian man holding an Algerian passport, financed by Libyans. So you can see, now we haven't had any people from the United States involved in that, but it is common knowledge in the intelligence community that some individuals from the United States have been trained and have been in touch with this type element.
Do you know whether or not the leading politicians in this nation have been advised to take precautions concerning possible kidnappings?
Yes, directly and indirectly. And you see more and more emphasis, maybe not so much taking formal training on the part of some of the political figures, but a lot of top industry, for example, who have executives who travel abroad. They have been made aware of this type kidnapping and what protective measures they can take for themselves, their family, whether they're in their vehicles, whether they're in their residence, and so on. And our top political figures, certainly the Secret Service has done a fantastic job, and they certainly have to stay abreast of all developments in this nature because they have basic responsibility of protection of the President of the United States, his family, and so on. So they're cognizant of this, and I'm sure that they have a complete training schedule set up so that there's a full awareness.
To what extent are the radical groups of the 60s and 70s operating today?
Well, I don't know percentage-wise we're even close. You do have some people who will raise questions as they did in the past, but you don't have the demonstrations, you don't have the confrontations that you had back then. So we don't have even close to the type activity. And maybe it's the transition. When you look back, how many college students in those days lost time from classes, for example, maybe a semester at a time because of some incidents that happened on the campus. I think there is the same awareness, but the age group is now identifying with the political system and asking their hard questions in a reasonable manner.
Is infiltration of these groups still a part of the activity of some FBI agents?
No, I'd say that here's where there has been quite a change, Tom, in our investigative responsibilities. Going back a relatively short period of time, we had roughly 21,000 investigations going in domestic intelligence areas, and now that's down to less than 100. Today, you have to show that the individual or the group with which he's affiliated has criminal intent or actually involved in criminal activity. To get involved in one of those investigations today on a local level, we would have to identify the individual, develop what his activities are, submit them to our headquarters for approval. Our headquarters would go to the Department of Justice. They would come back and say, yes, this falls within our guidelines. You can conduct an investigation. It is a sort of delayed process, but that's the only way we can get involved now.
You were quoted as saying earlier in the week that the Soviets have become much more interested in the state of Connecticut. What are they looking at over here?
Well, I don't know that that's correct by saying they've become more interested. I would say the Soviets have been interested in the state of Connecticut from the first moment they could identify the interest they might have here in a military vein. And to be realistic, you'd have to say, you know, Connecticut has the home port for the nuclear fleet, for example. There is construction of nuclear submarines in the state of Connecticut. When you look at the industrial complex throughout the state of Connecticut, there certainly is a military interest there. When you look at the business community, and all of this, when we talk espionage, everyone reacts first of all thinking military espionage, that they're going to steal some of our secret military secret. But the Soviets are interested in every facet of our society and what they can take by stealth or illegally to further their own manner of living or their own military complexion.
How do you know that they're active over here in that respect?
Well, they're active openly. For example, they'll attend industrial conventions. Mm-hmm. And the United States is a very open society. They can walk through an industrial convention and pick up literature that's handed out. It wouldn't be available in other countries, but again, it's a very competitive society here. They can walk through these industrial conventions and pick up a lot of information that's of interest to them and significance to their development. As far as the military, we just know that there's a continued presence because of the sophistication of our development and the need of all societies to try to stay abreast of each other in this area. In the state of Connecticut, it's difficult for them, more difficult, I'd say, because they don't have a physical presence. They have a presence in New York City, for example, because of the United Nations. It would be a little more unreasonable in Connecticut because to come to Connecticut, they would have to have authorization from the Department of State, for example. But again, to get back to your basic question, it's common knowledge that many of the representatives of the Soviet Union who come here, in addition to their normal function, have an intelligence function. So they have an advantage of us because of the presence of so many. We can't have that many people in the Soviet Union because the United Nations isn't over there.
Mr. Devine, our time is up. Thank you.
My pleasure.
John Devine, Special Agent in charge of the FBI in the state of Connecticut, has been our guest on Connecticut Newsmakers. I'm Tom Monaham. Good night.